Greetings, everyone. Here are the main geopolitical developments for June 25, 2026. And once again, I'll begin not with events on the Russia-Ukraine front. There are developments that may be even more significant from a geopolitical perspective. First, there is the mysterious transmission from the famous buzzer, also known as the so-called Doomsday Radio, which constantly broadcasts various signals. Recently, changes were detected in its activity. Several coded words of unknown meaning were transmitted. As a result, speculation has spread that Russia may have issued an order for a nuclear strike against Ukraine. In my view, that conclusion is not well supported. Still, it adds another layer of tension to the current international situation. The main story today involves the diplomatic scandal surrounding Zelensky's ultimatum to Belarus. Yesterday. From your perspective, Zelensky announced that relay stations located in Belarus, which had allegedly helped Russian drones identify targets inside Ukraine, had ceased operating. The shutdown of those systems, along with the suspension of Belarusian oil product sales to the Russian Federation, were reportedly conditions contained in Zelensky's ultimatum. If that is true, then it is undoubtedly a conciliatory move by Lukashenko. He clearly has no desire to see Belarus dragged into a war between Ukraine and Russia. At the same time, reports indicate that Belarus has announced a mobilization effort, currently described as military exercises. Nevertheless, this represents a serious test of the Belarusian military's ability to reach combat readiness in the event of a perceived threat from Ukraine. In reality, Ukraine currently lacks the capability to conduct an offensive operation against Belarus. Back in 2023, I argued that such an operation could have been a bold strategic strike. It could have completely altered the geopolitical chessboard on which Russia and Ukraine are playing. Had it succeeded, it might have significantly increased Ukraine's chances of winning the war. Today, however, that option no longer exists. Ukraine lacks the manpower necessary even to defend its current front line stretching from Kharkiv toward the Dnipro region. That front has become even longer. Now, it extends roughly another 150 kilometers north of Kharkiv. Across multiple sectors, Ukraine continues to face severe personnel shortages. Weapons are also in short supply. Under those circumstances, Belarus is hardly the top priority. However, Ukraine does retain the capability to strike Belarus with drones. Given the Belarusian military's limited preparation for modern warfare, such attacks could be extremely serious. Many facilities inside Belarus, including oil refineries, appear highly vulnerable to that type of strike. From that perspective, Lukashenko's desire to avoid entering the war on Russia's side is entirely understandable. It is also understandable that he could take such steps despite pressure from Russia. Western publications, including the Financial Times and the Wall Street Journal, have reported that Moscow is pressuring Belarus to enter the war following Zelensky's ultimatum. According to those reports, Russia's ambassador to Belarus has repeatedly discussed the issue with Lukashenko. If that is indeed the case, and we cannot verify it with certainty, then Lukashenko's actions are logical and understandable. Putin is not going to sever relations with Belarus over a few relay stations, nor does he really have the ability to do so. In this situation, the tail may end up wagging the dog. Still, the result will almost certainly be additional tension. That makes the recently strengthened ties between Lukashenko and Trump especially interesting. Even more important are the growing ties between Lukashenko and Xi Jinping. Those ties appear significant enough that China recently dispatched a special envoy from Beijing. The visitor was a vice, chairman-level state official, someone who may have aged out of top Communist Party structures but still retains considerable status within the Chinese state hierarchy. Following that visit to Belarus, Lukashenko began making a series of conciliatory gestures toward Ukraine. Zelensky responded with what many viewed as hostility and an ultimatum. Belarus cannot allow this ultimatum to trigger a war, nor can it afford Russian intervention that could make the situation even worse. In that context, Lukashenko's highly flexible and carefully maneuvered political strategy could ultimately prove beneficial for Belarus. Whether he can successfully carry it out remains an open question. Nevertheless, the Belarusian military mobilization exercises, the deployment of Belarusian special forces along border regions, and the presence of the Orishnik system in Belarus all suggest that Lukashenko has options. He could effectively reject Zelensky's demands without losing face. He could satisfy certain military concerns while simultaneously giving Zelensky an opportunity to claim that his objectives had been achieved. We will see how this situation develops. Lavrov has already stated that Russia will not halt military operations merely to begin negotiations with Ukraine. And we understand that every move toward escalation strengthens the position of Russian hawks. These are the figures calling for a nuclear strike against Ukraine and for a declaration of total mobilization inside Russia. That is why I mentioned the Doomsday Radio transmission earlier. As strange as it may sound, that station really exists. For reasons that remain unclear, it continues to be known as the Doomsday Radio. The Belarus issue may now represent the most direct path toward a major escalation of the Ukraine conflict. Russia is clearly not interested in negotiations at the present time. Meanwhile, there are numerous signals suggesting growing disappointment within Russia regarding Trump's position. There is also a sense that Moscow no longer intends to continue. Many view us pointless diplomatic outreach. Particularly important was a statement by Putin advisor Yuri Ushakov. He suggested that one side of a previous arrangement had failed to fulfill its obligations. The implication was clearly directed at the United States. That, in turn, strengthens those Russian hawks who are demanding mobilization and advocating nuclear escalation. We will discuss the nuclear question in greater detail on Friday. There is an older, but still fascinating book by Herman Kahn that outlines 44 stages of nuclear escalation. He examined in extraordinary detail how a nuclear war could begin, not with an immediate all-out exchange, instead through a gradual climb up an escalation ladder. We will examine that ladder and compare it with the current position of Russia and Ukraine. In fact, both sides may already have moved farther up that ladder than many people realize. One of the later stages involves a demonstrative nuclear strike. For example, detonating a device in space, on an isolated island, or in a remote desert. Such concepts have been discussed before and generally judged ineffective. The next stage would involve striking a small town or a military target, considered legitimate rather than a civilian area. Low-yield nuclear weapons exist that could destroy a specific facility without annihilating an entire city. The underlying message would essentially be, surrender quickly, or the escalation continues. This has always been one of Putin's objectives. The problem is that people have stopped reacting. For years, he repeatedly warned about nuclear consequences. Many now view those warnings as threats that were never followed by action. As a result, some observers argue that Russia's nuclear deterrence appears less credible than before. According to that line of thinking, a limited nuclear strike against a military-industrial facility, perhaps somewhere near Dnipro or another military target, would represent another step up Herman Khan's escalation ladder. We will discuss that possibility in more detail on Friday, assuming such a strike has not already occurred by then. Anything seems possible these days. That may be the most important geopolitical issue of the moment. Another major development is a response to the many Ukrainian commenters who reacted to my previous video about Russia's oil and fuel situation. Many insisted that Ukraine has nothing to do with Russia's fuel difficulties. Rather than respond individually, I'll repeat the underlying logic. Do not focus on dramatic images. Do not focus on burning refineries or spectacular footage of industrial fires. The images may be impressive, but what strategic value do they create? Do not listen to claims that Russia's economy will collapse tomorrow. Do not pay attention to exaggerated reports claiming that 40, 50, 60, or 70% of Russia's refining capacity has been destroyed. Those numbers are often wildly inflated. For Ukraine, there is only one number that truly matters: the volume of Russian hydrocarbon exports leaving oil ports. That export flow provides a huge share of the revenue needed to continue the war. If those exports are disrupted, Russia's ability to finance military operations becomes much more difficult. Strikes on Russian refineries mainly affect civilians. The military and the government remain supplied. Export infrastructure is different. That directly affects the resources available to the state. So what do we see? Today there were reports indicating that Russia may actually set a record for oil exports through its western ports in June. Exports from Primorsk, Ust-Luga, and Novorossiysk could reportedly reach approximately 2.8 million barrels per day. That would exceed May's volumes and establish a new record. So, while many celebrate refinery strikes and fuel shortages, Russia may simultaneously be exporting oil at record levels and earning record revenues. Those revenues can then be converted into military spending and weapons production. That is why some analysts argue that attacks on export infrastructure would be strategically more effective than attacks on refineries. Ukraine was targeting such facilities during March and April. Recently, those attacks appear to have become less frequent. The question is why? Is the objective strategic pressure? Or is it simply producing dramatic images? To use a familiar expression, do you want the decorative checkers? Or do you actually want the ride? Some people seem more interested in symbolism than results. Personally, I want Ukraine to be strong, prosperous, and free. I want Ukrainians to live well. I want a situation where people in Russia look at Ukraine with admiration rather than hostility. That is precisely why I continue to argue that refinery strikes, at least so far, have produced negative strategic effects. I warned before that the more refineries are damaged, the more crude oil can be redirected away from domestic consumption and toward export markets. That generates additional revenue. And additional revenue can be used to purchase components for missiles and other military systems. The army will receive fuel regardless. Civilian shortages are a separate issue. Unfortunately, events appear to be moving in exactly that direction, while many celebrate successful strikes against refineries. Russia may be increasing oil exports and generating even more income. From this perspective, the key indicator is not refinery damage. The key indicator is export volume. If export revenues continue rising, then the strategic objective has not been achieved. That is the argument I have been making from the beginning. Whether people agree with it or not, current developments appear to support that assessment. The emotional satisfaction of seeing explosions is one thing. The actual disruption of war financing is something entirely different, and only the second category truly matters in strategic terms. Against this backdrop, another major geopolitical development is the resignation of the commander of U.S. Army forces in Europe and Africa, General Christopher Donahue. The news was reported by the Financial Times. Why is this more important than many developments on the Ukrainian battlefield? Because it represents a shockwave within the U.S. military establishment. Donahue is considered one of the last true combat generals in the American armed forces. He is remembered as the officer who was among the final American commanders to leave Afghanistan during the U.S. withdrawal in 2021. The reasons behind his departure, coming only 2 months after his colleague, General Randy George, was removed from his position as Army Chief of Staff, are now the subject of intense discussion. Many observers attribute the situation to personal conflict with Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth. Reports suggest that Donahue's criticism of Hegseth was professional, direct, and uncompromising. According to that interpretation, Hegseth is now retaliating against a highly respected battlefield commander. The result has reportedly shaken confidence throughout the U.S. Army. Officers speaking to the Financial Times describe an atmosphere of fear extending all the way to the highest levels of command. For any military organization, that is a serious warning sign. According to those reports, an army operating under a climate of fear cannot function effectively in a major conflict. At the same time, some observers argue that such a restructuring could make it easier to use military institutions for domestic political purposes. The concern is that leaders who remove independent-minded officers are often seeking greater personal control over the armed forces. Throughout history, authoritarian systems have frequently followed that pattern. They remove commanders who are willing to challenge political leadership and replace them with individuals viewed as more loyal. That is why this development extends far beyond personnel changes. Inside the Pentagon, it has implications for the entire international system. Events inside the United States affect every major geopolitical actor on the planet. If political power becomes increasingly centralized in Washington, the consequences will be felt far beyond America's borders. That is why the resignation of General Donahue should not be dismissed as a routine military appointment. For many analysts, it represents a signal of deeper tensions within the American national security establishment. And those tensions are unfolding at a time when global instability is already increasing. That alone makes the story highly significant. Another development that fits into the broader pattern of escalation concerns a Ukrainian strike against a space communications center in Russia's Vladimir region. According to reports, two buildings were damaged. A fire broke out, and video footage of the incident quickly appeared online. The facility near Gusgrostelny is considered one of Russia's important long-range space communications centers. In addition to supporting civilian space communications, it is believed to have military relevance, including links to satellite operations. For that reason, the attack can be viewed as a strike against a sensitive component of Russia's strategic defense infrastructure. That immediately raises an important question. How long will a nuclear-armed state tolerate increasingly deep attacks on critical military facilities? Inside Russia, some hardline voices are demanding a much stronger response. Calls for large-scale retaliation, including discussions of nuclear options, are becoming louder within hawkish circles. Whether those demands influence actual policy is another matter, but the trend itself is impossible to ignore. The more pressure Russia faces from long-range Ukrainian strikes, the stronger those voices may become. That is especially true as Ukraine expands its ability to conduct medium-range and long-range attacks against targets deep inside Russian territory.